A century of British technology, 250,000 employees, the radar that won the war, over £2 billion in cash sitting in the bank. GEC didn't just make things, it made the things that made Britain work. The telephone exchanges, the frigates, the power stations. Then the new men arrived, and the spending began. The defence arm sold. $4.5 billion spent on 2 American companies nobody now remembers. A share price that fell 99%. 60,000 livelihoods scattered. What remains of GEC today belongs to Ericsson of Sweden. The shareholders got back half a penny in the pound. This is the story of how Britain's mightiest technology company was destroyed, not by foreign competition, not by changing markets, but by 2 men with a checkbook and a plan to make boring engineering exciting. The engineering survived, transferred to a different balance sheet. It was the company that died, a war chest built over 40 years, spent in 3, and a man who built an empire, dying on the day the last numbers came in. Chapter 1. The Wireless and the War Chest. The story begins with 2 arrivals on English soil. 2 men, born elsewhere, carrying nothing that looked like the future. One was a 21-year-old Italian with a black box full of wires and a letter of introduction from his mother's side of the family. The other was a German immigrant selling electrical components over a counter in London. Between them, separated by a decade, connected by nothing except the country that took them in, they'd plant the seeds of the largest technology company Britain has ever known. Guglielmo Marconi arrived in February 1896 with an idea the Italian government hadn't wanted. Gustav Binswanger had been in London since the early 1880s, quietly building a business in a trade most people still considered a novelty. Neither man knew the other existed. Neither could have imagined that the enterprises they were building, one rooted in the magic of invisible signals crossing empty air, the other in the hard commercial reality of wires, switches and electric bells, would one day merge into a single empire stretching from Chelmsford to Coventry to Liverpool, employing 250,000 people, building the radar that won a war, the telephone exchanges that connected a nation, and the frigates that defended it. And neither could have imagined that the empire born from their combined ambitions would be destroyed, not over decades of slow erosion, but in a furious 3-year bonfire lit by 2 men who believed boring engineering was dead and the internet was the future. But that destruction is the end of the story. The beginning is smaller, quieter. A young man on a ship from Bologna, a converted silk mill in a market town in Essex. And a signal, 3 short pulses, the Morse code letter S, crossing 2,000 miles of Atlantic Ocean to change the world. The man who sent that signal couldn't get into university. Chapter 2. Signals Across the Water. Guglielmo Marconi was born on the 25th of April, 1874, in Bologna, Italy, the son of a wealthy Italian landowner named Giuseppe and an Irish mother, Annie Jameson, whose family's name still sits on whiskey bottles in every pub in the British Isles. It was a comfortable childhood. Private tutors, a grand family estate. The Villa Grifone at Pontecchio, nestled in the hills south of Bologna. The kind of upbringing that might have produced a gentleman farmer, a minor diplomat, or a man of comfortable leisure who never needed to prove anything to anyone. Instead, it produced a boy who couldn't stop thinking about invisible waves. The young Marconi had encountered the work of Heinrich Hertz, the German physicist who demonstrated in 1887 that electromagnetic waves could be transmitted through the air. Hertz himself had seen no practical use for his discovery. "It's of no use whatsoever," he'd reportedly said. Marconi disagreed. By late 1894, aged just 20, and he'd turned the attic of the Villa Grifone into a laboratory, rigging together crude transmitters and receivers, ringing bells from across the room without a single connecting wire. His father thought it was a waste of time. His mother thought it was extraordinary. She was right. The breakthrough came not from some flash of genius in a single afternoon, but from patient, methodical tinkering. The kind of work that doesn't look like genius until it produces results. Marconi discovered that if he connected both the transmitter and the receiver to the ground, literally earthing the apparatus, and if he raised the antenna higher, the range of his signals extended dramatically. He wasn't working from any established theory. He was feeling his way forward, testing, adjusting, testing again. It was engineering by instinct, and it worked. And by the summer of 1895, he was sending signals across the full width of the family estate, over a mile. His father, finally persuaded this wasn't a hobby, agreed to fund further experiments. But when Marconi approached the Italian government for support, offering his invention to the country of his birth, the response was silence. The Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs saw no future in wireless communication. Cables worked. Cables were proven. Why would anyone need to send a message through the air? It was Annie Jameson Marconi who saw the way forward. Her family connections ran deep into the Anglo-Irish establishment. She arranged for her son to travel to England, to a country whose vast maritime empire depended on communication across oceans, and whose post office was run by engineers with the imagination, to see what a young Italian with a black box might offer them. Marconi arrived in London in February 1896. He was 21 years old, spoke limited English, and carried with him the apparatus that would change the century. Customs officials at Dover, suspicious of the foreign equipment, reportedly damaged some of it during inspection. It didn't matter. Under the guidance of his cousin, Henry Jameson Davis, an experienced London businessman who understood how the city's institutions worked, Marconi moved quickly. On the 2nd of June, 1896, he filed British patent number 12,039, the world's first patent for a system of wireless telegraphy. The demonstrations began almost immediately. On Salisbury Plain in September 1896, Marconi showed engineers from the post office and the military that he could transmit signals over a distance of nearly 2 miles. William Preece, the post office's chief engineer and a man of considerable influence, was impressed enough to champion the young inventor publicly. "The distance to which signals have been sent is remarkable," Preece told the British Association for the Advancement of Science. Marconi, standing quietly beside the man who was opening doors for him across the British establishment, understood something important. In England, people were listening. What followed was a sequence of demonstrations so rapid and so dramatic that they read less like engineering progress and more like a conjuring act performed at increasing scale. On the 13th of May, 1897, Marconi transmitted the first wireless signal ever sent over open sea, across the Bristol Channel, from Flatholm Island to Lavernock Point in Wales. The message was 3 words: "Are you ready?" The distance was modest, roughly 6 miles, but the principle was epical. Signals could cross water. The implications for a maritime nation with the world's largest navy were obvious to everyone in the room. 2 months later, on the 20th of July 1897, the Wireless Telegraph and Signal Company was registered in London. Marconi had his business. He was 23 years old. By December 1898, the company had outgrown its London premises and opened the world's first wireless factory, a converted silk mill on Hall Street, Chelmsford, in Essex. 26 employees. The building had previously been used for weaving fabric, and now it was being used to weave signals out of thin air. Chelmsford, a quiet market town an hour's train ride from London, had no idea that this modest factory would make it the birthplace of British broadcasting and anchor it to the story of wireless communication for the next century. But the moment that made Marconi's name, the moment that turned a promising young inventor into a global figure, came on the 12th of December 1901. From a transmitting station at Poldhu, on the cliffs of Cornwall, a signal was sent westward across the Atlantic. At Signal Hill, St. John's, Newfoundland, 2,100 miles away, Marconi pressed a telephone headset to his ear and listened. 3 faint clicks. Pip, pip, pip. The Morse code letter S. It was the first transatlantic wireless signal. Scientists had argued it was impossible, that the curvature of the Earth would block the transmission. They were wrong. The signal had somehow bent around the planet, following the curve of the ionosphere in a way that wouldn't be fully understood for another 2 decades. Marconi didn't need to understand why it worked. He knew that it did, and the world knew it too. 11 years later, in April 1912, Marconi's invention proved its worth in circumstances no one could have anticipated. When the RMS Titanic struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic, it was the Marconi wireless operators aboard, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, who sent the distress signals that brought the Carpathia racing to the scene. 700 lives were saved, and the Postmaster General declared in Parliament that those who survived owed their lives to Marconi and his invention. Marconi himself had been offered free passage on the Titanic. He'd declined, not out of premonition, but because the Lusitania, sailing 3 days earlier, had a public stenographer he preferred for his paperwork. His invention saved 700 lives. His preference for a typist saved his own. While Marconi was sending signals across the Atlantic, a quieter revolution in British industry was gathering pace barely an hour's journey from Chelmsford, in the workshops and warehouses of London, Birmingham and Salford. Gustav Binswanger had arrived in England from Germany in the early 1880s, a Jewish immigrant who established himself as a wholesaler of electrical goods under the name G. Binswanger and Company. In 1886, a fellow German immigrant named Hugo Hurst joined the firm. Hurst was the spark the business needed. Where Binswanger was cautious and methodical, Hurst was restless, ambitious, and possessed of an instinct for what was coming next. He travelled across Europe, seeking out the latest electrical products, lamps, switches, motors, anything that ran on this new and still slightly miraculous force called electricity. Together, they renamed the business the General Electric Apparatus Company. Binswanger, perhaps sensing the rising anti-German sentiment that would intensify in the decades ahead, later changed his own name to Bing. The company name would change too. By 1889, it was incorporated as the General Electric Company Limited, GEC. Hurst's genius was commercial rather than scientific, but it was genius nonetheless. He understood, earlier than almost anyone in British business, that electricity wasn't a curiosity or a luxury. It was an infrastructure. It would power homes, light streets, drive factories, connect telephones, and whoever supplied the equipment for that transformation would build an empire. In 1887, the company published the first comprehensive electrical goods catalogue of its kind, a directory of everything from ceiling roses to carbon arc lamps. In 1888, Hurst acquired GEC's first factory in Salford, manufacturing electric bells, telephones and switches, the company that would one day build torpedo systems, nuclear power stations and the avionics for the Boeing 777 started by making doorbells. By the turn of the century, GEC was growing fast. A Hurst's lamp gamble, a heavy investment in electric lighting during the 1890s, paid off spectacularly. By 1909, GEC's lamp subsidiary, Osram, was producing the most successful tungsten filament lamps in the industry. The profits were enormous. Hurst reinvested relentlessly. New factories, new products, new markets. GEC's slogan, "Everything Electrical," wasn't just marketing. It was becoming literally true. Two immigrant stories, two parallel empires rising from nothing in the same country at the same time. One built on the romance of invisible signals, the other built on the hard commercial logic of selling a nation its own electrical future. They wouldn't merge for another 60 years. But when they did, the company they created would be worth £35 billion. And the man who'd build it into that empire was, in 1898, not yet born, the son of a Polish-Jewish tailor in Stoke Newington, London, an orphan by the age of 11, a boy whose early life offered no sign whatsoever that he'd one day control the largest private employer in Britain and accumulate the war chest whose destruction would become a national scandal. His name was Lord Weinstock, and his story is next. Chapter 3. Everything Electrical. The first half of the 20th century transformed both companies from promising ventures into national institutions, but by very different routes and at very different speeds. Marconi's wireless telegraph company, renamed in 1900, expanded with a pace that matched its founder's appetite for dramatic milestones. The Royal Navy, grasping the strategic implications of ship-to-shore communication faster than most, had equipped 3 warships with Marconi wireless sets as early as 1899. Commercial shipping followed. Within a decade, every major liner crossing the Atlantic carried Marconi equipment and Marconi-trained operators. The company wasn't just selling hardware, it was selling a service, a global network of coastal stations, shipboard installations, and trained personnel that made Marconi's name synonymous with wireless communication itself. In 1907, the first transatlantic radio broadcasting service opened between Clifton on the west coast of Ireland and Glace Bay, Nova Scotia. Messages that had previously taken days by cable could now be transmitted in minutes. The Chelmsford factory expanded. The workforce grew from dozens to hundreds. A purpose-built factory opened at New Street, Chelmsford, in 1912, a substantial industrial facility that would remain the heart of Marconi's operations for the better part of a century. That same year, 1912, brought the company its first serious political crisis. The Marconi scandal, a tangled affair of government contracts and alleged insider trading, implicated some of the most powerful figures in British politics. David Lloyd George, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, and Rufus Isaacs, the Attorney General, were accused of buying shares in the American Marconi Company while the British government was negotiating a wireless contract with the British Marconi Company. A parliamentary inquiry followed. Reputations were damaged, careers wobbled, but the company itself survived. Its technology was too important, its contracts too vital for the scandal to sink it. And the Great War accelerated everything. Marconi's facilities were placed under Admiralty direction. The company provided military wireless communications across every theatre of the conflict, equipment that allowed commanders to coordinate operations across distances that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier. The war proved what Marconi had always believed, that wireless wasn't a novelty, it was a necessity, and for a nation fighting a global war, it was a matter of survival. But it was after the war that Marconi's Chelmsford works produced something that would reshape daily life across Britain in ways even its founder hadn't anticipated. On the 15th of June, 1920, Dame Nellie Melba, the most celebrated opera singer in the world, arrived at the Marconi works in Chelmsford to give a song recital. It was transmitted using a 15-kilowatt Marconi transmitter. The broadcast was heard across Europe and as far away as Persia. It was the first advertised public broadcast in British history. The age of radio had begun, and it had begun in a factory in Essex. Within 2 years, the demand for broadcasting had grown so rapidly that the government intervened. Marconi's broadcasting activities were merged with those of several competitors to form the British Broadcasting Company, later the British Broadcasting Corporation. The BBC. The institution that would become the voice of the nation was born from Marconi's experiments in Chelmsford. The birthplace of British broadcasting wasn't London. It was a wireless factory in a market town. GEC's trajectory through the same decades was less romantic, but no less consequential. A Hugo Hurst had built the company into a formidable industrial presence by the time war broke out in 1914. The Witton Engineering Works near Birmingham, opened in 1902, was GEC's first purpose-built factory, a declaration of manufacturing ambition that went far beyond the Salford workshop where the company had started making electric bells. Hurst's telephone gamble proved as shrewd as his lamp gamble. In 1907, the Peel Connor Telephone Works was established to manufacture telephone exchanges for the General Post Office. By 1919, telephone manufacturing had moved to Coventry, establishing the Midlands city as a GEC stronghold that would endure for the rest of the century. Coventry workers would build telephone exchanges for decades, their hands shaping the physical infrastructure of British communication long before anyone dreamed of digital. The Great War turned GEC from a significant company into a national asset. By war's end, over 90% of GEC's business was military: radios, signalling lamps, arc lamp carbons, motors, wiring. The workforce exceeded 15,000. Hearst had proven that his company could deliver at scale, under pressure, when the nation needed it most. It was a lesson GEC would repeat in the next war, with far greater consequences. In 1919, GEC established a research centre headed by no less a figure than Sir J.J. Thomson, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist who'd discovered the electron. The Hearst Research Centre, opened at Wembley in 1923, became one of Britain's most significant industrial research facilities. A GEC wasn't just manufacturing anymore, it was innovating. Through the 1920s, the company was involved in building Britain's national grid, the vast electrical distribution network that would bring power to every corner of the country. New headquarters at Magnet House on Kingsway, London, announced the company's arrival at the centre of British industrial life. Then came the Second War, and with it, a scientific breakthrough that would prove more decisive than almost any weapon in the Allied arsenal. In 1940, at the University of Birmingham, two physicists named John Randall and Harry Boot invented the cavity magnetron, a device capable of generating short-wavelength microwaves at sufficient power to make airborne radar a practical reality. Before the cavity magnetron, radar sets were bulky, imprecise, and limited in range. After it, an aircraft and ships could detect enemy targets with a precision that changed the entire character of the war. The cavity magnetron made the Battle of Britain survivable. It made the Battle of the Atlantic winnable. When it was shared with America later that year as part of the Tizard mission, a secret exchange of military technology, it was described as the most valuable cargo ever to cross the Atlantic Ocean. GEC manufactured radar systems, communications equipment, valves and lighting throughout the war. The Marconi Company, by now a separate entity but destined to merge with GEC within 3 decades, did the same. Its Chelmsford works turning out military wireless and radar equipment at a pace that would have astonished the 26 men who'd worked in the silk mill on Hall Street. By 1939, Marconi had formally established its research laboratories at Great Baddow, Essex, a facility that would become one of the most important defence electronics research centres in Europe, doing work so classified that many of its own employees didn't fully know what was happening in the next corridor. The war cemented both companies as pillars of national defence and industrial capability, but the peace brought problems that neither war nor wireless could solve. At GEC, Hugo Hearst's death in 1943 left a succession vacuum that would take 2 decades to fill. His successors, Leslie Gamage and Harry Railing, proved competent managers but uninspired leaders. Despite enormous post-war demand for electrical goods, a country rebuilding itself needed everything GEC could make. Profits fell. The company drifted. By the late 1950s, GEC was large, respected and stagnant. It had the factories, the workforce, the product range and the reputation. What it lacked was a leader. That leader was already inside the building. Or rather, inside a much smaller building, the offices of Radio and Allied Industries. A modest television set manufacturer run by an industrialist named Michael Sobel. Arnold Weinstock had married Sobel's daughter, Netta, in 1949. He joined his father-in-law's company in 1954. His background offered no clue to what would follow. Born on the 29th of July, 1924, in Stoke Newington, North London, Arnold was the son of Polish-Jewish immigrants. His father was a tailor. Both parents died when he was young. He was orphaned by the age of 11, raised thereafter by an elder brother. He attended the London School of Economics, studying statistics. During the war, he served as a junior administrative officer in the Admiralty, working on government procurement from an office in Bath. It was unglamorous, bureaucratic work, requisitioning supplies, tracking expenditure, learning, without knowing it, the financial mechanics that would one day make him the most feared industrialist in Britain. After the war, Weinstock worked in property development under a man named Louis Scott, learning the techniques of sale and leaseback, buying property, selling it to an investor, then leasing it back. It was clever, technical work that taught him to see value where others saw only assets. But it wasn't until he entered Michael Sobel's company that Weinstock discovered what he was genuinely built for. At Radio and Allied Industries, Weinstock found a small company that made television sets. He applied to it the same relentless financial discipline he'd absorbed in the Admiralty and refined in property: tight cost control, high volumes, obsessive monitoring of margins. The company prospered. He took it public in 1958. And then he did something audacious. In 1961, Radio and Allied Industries, small, profitable, and run by a man whose ambition far exceeded the size of his company, staged a reverse takeover of GEC. The minnow swallowed the whale. Weinstock became a GEC director. By 1963, he was managing director. He was 38 years old, and he was in charge of one of the largest electrical companies in Britain, a company that was, in his view, bloated, complacent, and ripe for transformation. What followed was a 6-year campaign of acquisition and consolidation so sweeping that it reshaped the entire British electrical industry. In 1967, Weinstock launched a hostile takeover of Associated Electrical Industries, AEI, a sprawling conglomerate that encompassed Metropolitan Vickers, British Thomson Houston, Edison Swan, and Hotpoint. It was a prolonged, bitter battle. AEI's management fought hard. The financial press was riveted. Weinstock won. The prize was enormous. Some of the most storied names in British engineering brought under a single roof. The following year, 1968, came the merger with English Electric, itself a major conglomerate that included the Marconi Company, Elliott Brothers, the Vulcan Foundry, and dozens of other businesses. This merger was done with the active encouragement of Harold Wilson's government, which saw Weinstock as the man who could rationalise Britain's fragmented electrical industry into a single, globally competitive force. The Industrial Reorganisation Corporation, Wilson's instrument for restructuring British industry, gave its blessing. The deal went through. By the end of the 1960s, Arnold Weinstock controlled virtually everything that mattered in British electrical engineering: GEC, AEI, English Electric, Marconi. The companies that had built the radar, the telephone exchanges, the power stations, the ship's communications, the broadcasting equipment. All of it now answered to one man, the tailor's orphan from Stoke Newington with a statistics degree and an obsession with financial ratios. A contemporary profile described him as the first British exemplar of the management revolution. Harold Wilson embraced him. A James Callaghan valued his counsel. The financial press, which had watched with a mixture of awe and unease as Weinstock assembled his empire, began to treat him as something close to an oracle of British industrial management. He wasn't universally loved. His methods were ruthless. The rationalisations that followed each acquisition meant factory closures, redundancies, the elimination of duplicate operations. Thousands of jobs disappeared as Weinstock stripped out what he considered waste. One trade union leader would later describe him, with grim accuracy, as Britain's largest unemployer. It was not an entirely unfair characterisation, but what Weinstock left standing was formidable. A company that made everything from a television set to the components in an RAF fighter. An empire of factories stretching across the length of Britain: Chelmsford, Coventry, Liverpool, Wembley, Gateshead, Stafford, Leicester, Rochester, a workforce that at its peak would exceed 250,000 people. And a war chest, a mountain of cash, carefully hoarded, jealously guarded, growing year by year, that Weinstock considered the ultimate guarantee of survival. He'd built the fortress, he'd filled the treasury, he'd made the company, as far as anyone could tell, unsinkable. The men who'd sink it hadn't arrived yet. Chapter 4. The Man with the Speed Dialer. To understand what GEC became under Arnold Weinstock, you need to understand the instrument he used to run it. Not a boardroom, not a management committee, not a strategy document circulated among directors with leather-bound folders and embossed covers. A telephone. Specifically, a telephone with a speed dialer, a device that gave him a direct line to scores of managers across the empire at the push of a button. They lived in fear of that telephone. Weinstock's system was deceptively simple. Every division, every subsidiary, every factory, from Chelmsford to Coventry to Liverpool, submitted monthly financial returns. 7 key ratios, monitored obsessively. Profit margin, sales per employee, capital employed, stock turnover, debtor ratios, creditor ratios, cash generation. Any deviation from the expected trajectory, a margin slipping 0.5 percentage point, a stock ratio creeping upward, a debtor figure that suggested someone wasn't collecting their invoices fast enough, triggered a phone call. Not a memo, not a meeting request. A phone call. Weinstock's voice on the line, precise, probing, unyielding. Ray Wheeler, a GEC associate director who witnessed the system from the inside, put it bluntly. Nobody took any notice of the main board. Basically, it never met. The formal governance structures of one of Britain's largest companies were, in practice, decorative. GEC wasn't run by committees or consensus. It was run by one man reading financial returns at his desk and reaching for the speed dialer. Arthur Walsh, who served as managing director of the Marconi subsidiary and later as chairman of STC, confirmed the picture from the other side of those phone calls. At GEC, a majority on the board just doesn't apply, he said. It's a question of whether Arnold wants it or not. There was no ambiguity. There was no second guessing. If Weinstock wanted something done, it was done. If Weinstock didn't want something done, it didn't happen. And if you couldn't explain why your numbers had moved in the wrong direction, the conversation that followed was not one you'd forget in a hurry. The austerity was legendary and, in its way, perversely magnificent. The head office at Stanhope Gate in Mayfair was notoriously Spartan. One memo instructed that it might be a good idea to remove every other bulb in offices and corridors. The man running Britain's largest electrical company was trying to save money on electricity. Directors were expected to buy their own copies of the Financial Times. Private telephone calls were monitored for cost. The message was unmistakable, filtering down from the managing director's office to every factory floor in the empire. Waste nothing. Count everything. The numbers are all that matter. It wasn't lovable. It wasn't meant to be. But it worked. And the empire those numbers governed was vast. By the 1980s, GEC was Britain's largest private employer. Over 250,000 people, when you included the joint ventures. One of the original companies listed on the new FTSE 100 index in 1984. A business whose tentacles reached into almost every corner of British industrial life. Walk into the Chelmsford works in those years and you entered the spiritual home of the Marconi name. The new street site, descendants of that original 1912 factory, was the centre of radar, communications and defence electronics. The Marconi Research Centre at Great Baddow, a few miles away, was where the classified work happened. The work that many employees couldn't fully discuss even with their own families. Facilities at Basildon and Billericay and Writtle extended the footprint across Essex. The air in the radar assembly rooms carried the smell of solder and warm electronics. That particular tang of flux and heated circuit board that any engineer who's worked with their hands will recognise instantly. Test equipment hummed at frequencies you felt more than heard. In the clean rooms, where precision instruments were calibrated to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, engineers in white coats worked alongside technicians in overalls. The hierarchy of the works floor giving way to the shared discipline of getting the thing right. Tea trolleys navigated corridors lined with filing cabinets of technical drawings. The accumulated knowledge of decades of British defence engineering stored in paper and pencil, guarded by women who knew exactly which drawer held which specification, and would tell you so if you asked nicely. In Coventry, the works had a different character but the same underlying seriousness. Telephone exchange manufacturing had been rooted here since 1919, and by the 1970s and 1980s, the Coventry operations had evolved from the electromechanical era into the digital age. The transition was physical. You could walk through the factory and see it happening. In one section, skilled hands were still wiring Strauger switching equipment, the click and rattle of electromechanical relays, the satisfying mechanical precision of technology that had connected British telephone calls for half a century. In another section, the future was arriving. System X, the first fully digital telephone exchange, partly developed and manufactured here. The old and the new, separated by a corridor and a generation of engineering, sharing the same roof and the same canteen. Liverpool housed communications and networking equipment, over 630 employees at peak, producing the hardware that carried signals across distances Marconi himself would have marvelled at. The Wembley site held the Hearst Research Centre, still doing the pioneering work Hugo Hearst had endowed it for. Other sites spread across the country like outposts of an industrial state. Gateshead, Stafford, Leicester, Rochester for avionics, Barrow-in-Furness for submarines, after the VSEL acquisition. Dozens more, each with its own culture, its own expertise, its own place in the GEC universe. What did they make? The answer was almost absurdly broad. Turn everything from a television set to the components in an RAF fighter. Defence electronics, radar systems, torpedo guidance, naval combat systems, fly-by-wire avionics. Telecommunications, the telephone exchanges that connected every call in Britain. Power generation equipment for the stations that kept the lights on. Medical imaging through Picker International. Consumer electronics through Hotpoint. Lifts through Express Lifts. Weighing equipment through Avery. Railway traction systems. If it was electrical and Britain needed it, GEC probably made it, or owned a company that did. And underneath all of it, Weinstock's financial discipline held the structure together. He understood something that his successors would catastrophically forget. This company made things, physical things, in factories, by engineers. And the numbers mattered because they measured the health of the thing-making. They were not an end in themselves. They were the pulse rate of a living enterprise. Weinstock respected the craft even as he demanded the margins. He knew the difference between cost control and cost destruction. He cut waste. He didn't cut capability. At least not intentionally. His critics, and there were many, argued that his obsession with financial returns had starved the company of investment. That the research budgets were too low. That the factories needed modernisation. That GEC was becoming a company brilliant at counting its money and increasingly less brilliant at spending it on the innovations that would secure the future. There was truth in this. Weinstock would later acknowledge, in his elliptical way, that certain investments had been deferred too long. But in the 1980s, those criticisms were theoretical. The company was profitable. The cash was accumulating. The order books were full. And for 250,000 people, the works hooter still meant what it had always meant. Stability, purpose, a wage packet on Friday. Chapter 5, 250,000. The numbers tell part of the story. Under Weinstock, GEC's turnover rose from £100 million in 1960, the year he'd effectively taken control, to £11 billion at his retirement in 1996. A 110-fold increase in 33 years. Annual profits exceeded £1 billion at peak. The company was among the largest in the FTSE 100, a pillar of the British economy, a name that appeared in every serious discussion about the future of the nation's industrial base. But numbers are abstractions. They describe scale. They don't describe the daily reality of what it meant to live and work inside a company that employed more people than some British cities had residents. For the towns that hosted GEC's factories, the company wasn't an employer. It was an ecosystem, an identity, a way of life so deeply embedded in the rhythms of the community that separating the two was like trying to remove the foundation from a house while the family was still living in it. Chelmsford belonged to Marconi. The relationship wasn't just economic, it was cultural, almost spiritual. The town's claim to be the birthplace of radio wasn't a tourist board invention. It was historical fact, rooted in the converted silk mill on Hall Street, where 26 men had started building wireless equipment in 1898. By the 1980s, the Marconi name was woven into the fabric of Chelmsford life. Streets named for wireless pioneers. The Marconi Athletic and Social Club, where workers and their families gathered for dances, sports, and the social calendar that glued the community together. The Marconi Veterans Association, founded in the late 1920s for employees with long service, was itself a monument to how long careers lasted at the company and how deep the bonds ran. You didn't just work for Marconi, you belonged to it. And in many families, that belonging stretched across generations. Grandfather, father, son, each walking through the same gates, each learning the same craft, each carrying the same quiet pride in what they built. Stephen Temple joined Marconi as an apprentice at Chelmsford in 1961. He'd go on to write a handbook on an early radar system, work in Marconi's space division, and eventually become a prominent figure in UK telecommunications policy. But his career began in the way thousands of Chelmsford careers began. As a young man entering the gates of a company that would teach him a trade, give him a profession, and connect him to something larger than himself. The apprenticeship programme wasn't just training. It was a pathway. From school leaver to skilled engineer, from novice to professional, from boy to man. For families who couldn't afford university, it was the most valuable door that could be opened. In Coventry, the story was the same in its essentials but different in its texture. Coventry was a manufacturing city. Cars, aerospace, engineering, and GEC was one of the pillars that held the whole structure up. Workers moved between GEC, Jaguar, Rolls-Royce, and the network of smaller firms that supplied them all. It was an ecosystem of skills and employment, each company feeding the others, each providing the kind of work that allowed men and women to build lives of substance and stability on the strength of what they could do, with their hands and their training. Karen Hancox, a Coventry resident who lived through both the golden age and the decline, would later recall with the particular vividness of someone describing something precious that had been taken away. Think back to the good old GEC days when virtually every person in Coventry worked there. It was an exaggeration, of course. Coventry had many employers.
But it captured a truth that statistics alone couldn't convey. GEC was so large, so present, so woven into the daily life of the city that it felt like the foundation itself. Over 4,500 people worked at the Coventry site at peak. Their wages paid mortgages, educated children, sustained pubs and shops and social clubs across the city. Remove GEC from Coventry and you didn't just lose jobs. You lost the economic gravity that held an entire community in orbit. The wage packet culture was its own institution. Stable employment, predictable income. The rhythms of shift work shaping the rhythms of family life. The morning walk to the gates, the midday break, the evening return, the Friday payslip that translated hours of skilled labour into the tangible certainties of rent paid, food bought, children clothed.
It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the stuff of ambition as the financial press understood it. But it was real, and it worked. And for hundreds of thousands of families, it was the scaffolding on which everything else was built. Trade unions were a powerful presence across GEC's operations. The AEU, the MSF, later Amicus. Shop stewards carried real authority on the factory floor. The relationship between management and unions was not always harmonious. Weinstock's rationalizations had cost thousands of jobs, and the unions hadn't forgotten it. But it was a relationship, conducted within structures that both sides understood. There were negotiations. There were agreements. There were grievances and settlements and the ongoing, grinding process of two forces with different interests finding ways to coexist inside the same walls. Women workers formed a significant part of the GEC workforce, particularly in assembly and wiring roles, the meticulous, hands-on work of connecting components and soldering joints that required dexterity, patience, and a kind of precision that the engineering profession, in its traditional snobbery, sometimes undervalued. The wartime expansion had brought women into previously male-dominated areas of the factories, and many had stayed. Their contribution was essential. The telephone exchanges that connected Britain's calls, the radar systems that defended its skies, these were assembled in large part by women whose names never appeared in annual reports or trade press profiles, but whose skill was embedded in every unit that left the factory floor. This was the world Arnold Weinstock had built. Not single-handedly. The companies he'd absorbed had their own histories, their own cultures, their own identities stretching back decades before he arrived. But the structure that held them all together, the financial architecture that kept the money flowing and the factories running and the wage packets arriving on Friday, that was his. And for all its imperfections, the underinvestment his critics identified, the austerity that sometimes shaded into parsimony, the autocratic governance that left no room for voices other than his own, it was a structure that sustained 250,000 livelihoods across the length and breadth of Britain. What replaced it would sustain nothing at all. Chapter 6. Eggs in several baskets. The secret to GEC's durability, the thing that made it, in the eyes of the city, as simultaneously admirable and infuriating, was the portfolio. Weinstock didn't believe in putting all his eggs in one basket. He believed in putting them in as many baskets as he could find. Defence electronics contributed up to 40% of group profits by the mid-1980s. The capabilities were staggering in their range. Radar systems, Unsinkable, including the ECR-90 for the Eurofighter Typhoon, one of the most advanced combat radar sets in the world. Torpedo systems through Marconi underwater systems. Naval combat systems fitted to the warships of the Royal Navy and Allied navies around the globe. Type 23 frigates, GEC, built 12 of the 16 ships in the class. 3/4 of an entire class of Royal Navy warships came from a single company. Submarine construction, and added to the portfolio with the acquisition of VSEL at Barrow-in-Furness in 1995. And Boeing 777 fly-by-wire avionics, GEC's technology helping to control the flight systems of the world's most advanced commercial aircraft. Alongside defence sat telecommunications, telephone exchanges for the GPO and later BT, including the System X digital exchanges that represented Britain's transition from analogue to digital switching. Power generation equipment through the GEC Alstom joint venture with France's Alstom, a European heavyweight in rail and energy. Medical imaging through Picker International. GPT, a telecommunications joint venture with Siemens of Germany. Alenia Marconi Systems, a defence electronics partnership with Italy's Finmeccanica. And each joint venture served a dual purpose. It gave GEC access to markets and technologies beyond its own reach, and it made the company structurally almost impossible to take over. An unwanted bidder couldn't easily absorb GEC without untangling a web of international partnerships that stretched across France, Germany, Italy, and the United States. Weinstock understood this perfectly. The joint ventures weren't just commercial arrangements, they were defensive architecture, and at the centre of the fortress sat the thing Weinstock valued above everything else: the cash mountain. Over £2 billion in cash reserves by the mid-1990s. Some sources put the figure at £1.5 billion in the 1980s, growing steadily through internal cash generation until it exceeded £2 billion by the time Weinstock retired. And no reliance on external debt, no borrowing. Acquisitions funded entirely from internal cash flow. The company sat on its money like a dragon on a hoard, and Weinstock saw nothing wrong with this. Saving money was every bit as entrepreneurial as spending it, he said. The cash was survival insurance. It meant GEC could weather any downturn, fund any opportunity, and answer to no banker. Not all businesses are in recession at the same time, Weinstock observed. The diversification and the cash together created a company that could absorb shocks other firms couldn't survive. And then there was the man himself, the personal contradictions that made Weinstock impossible to categorize and oddly compelling to observe. This was a man who counted every light bulb in the office and made his directors buy their own newspapers. And this was also a man with a passionate love of opera, a regular at Covent Garden, a connoisseur of voice and staging. And this was a man who, with his father-in-law Michael Sobel, owned the Ballymacole Stud in County Meath, Ireland, one of the finest thoroughbred racing operations in the British Isles. In 1979, Weinstock's horse Troy won the Derby. The man who removed every other light bulb from the corridors of GEC's headquarters owned a champion racehorse. The juxtaposition was irresistible, and those who knew him understood that both sides were genuine. The austerity wasn't a performance. Neither was the passion. Weinstock was simply a man who saw no contradiction between counting pennies in the office and spending lavishly on the things that stirred his soul. His relationships with power were complex and evolved over time. 4 prime ministers valued his counsel, Wilson and Callaghan actively, Thatcher initially. In 1978, Professor William Gosling declared, "Without Sir Arnold and his company, Britain's balance of payments would be unmanageable." It wasn't empty flattery. GEC's defence exports alone were a significant contributor to the national accounts. But relations with Thatcher soured over defence contracts and privatisation. Weinstock's instinct for government partnership clashed with Thatcher's instinct for market freedom, and the two strong personalities failed to find the accommodation that might have benefited both. The city, meanwhile, grew increasingly restless. Analysts and institutional investors looked at the cash mountain and saw not prudence but paralysis. GEC's share price underperformed compared to its American namesake, General Electric. The criticism sharpened year by year. Weinstock was good at generating cash, but less good at spending it. He was sitting on a fortune and doing nothing with it. The company, they argued, was being managed for survival rather than growth. A hostile bid, futile but symbolically significant, was launched, attempting to unlock the cash Weinstock refused to deploy. It failed. Weinstock held the line. But the pressure was real, and it was mounting. And the fortress that Weinstock had spent 33 years building, the diversified portfolio, the joint ventures, the cash mountain, the financial discipline, all of it depended on one thing continuing: Arnold Weinstock running GEC. The moment he stopped, everything he'd built became vulnerable to someone with a different idea about what the money was for. And Chapter 7. Cash in the bank earns a very low return. In the early to mid-1990s, GEC stood at its zenith. Turnover of £11 billion. Profits exceeding £1 billion. A cash mountain above £2 billion. Britain's second largest defence contractor, behind only British Aerospace. A company whose products ranged from the avionics in the world's most advanced commercial aircraft to the telephone exchanges that connected every call in the country. If you'd looked at GEC in 1995 and tried to imagine the circumstances under which it could be destroyed within a decade, you'd have struggled. The fortress seemed impregnable. The war chest was overflowing. The order books were full. But Weinstock was 71 years old. And the succession plan he'd spent years carefully nurturing had just been destroyed by something no amount of financial discipline could prevent. Simon Weinstock, Arnold's son, born in 1952, had been groomed for the role his father would one day vacate. He was a GEC director, active in the business, understood by those around him to be the chosen heir. Arnold had never publicly declared it. That wasn't his way. But the direction was clear to anyone paying attention. Simon would inherit the empire. The dynasty would continue. The discipline would endure. On the 18th of May, 1996, Simon Weinstock died of cancer. He was 44 years old. For Arnold Weinstock, the loss was devastating in ways that went beyond the personal grief of a father burying his son. Simon's death didn't just break a heart. It broke the succession. The man who'd spent 3 decades building a fortress had no one he trusted to hand the keys to. And the city, which had been pressing for change, for new leadership, for someone who would unlock the cash mountain and spend it, now had its opening. The pressure intensified. Shareholders wanted action. Weinstock was aging. His heir was dead. The financial press demanded a new direction, someone younger, more dynamic, more willing to deploy the cash that Weinstock had hoarded for 30 years. The criticism that had once been manageable background noise became an unavoidable chorus. On the 18th of March 1996, Before Simon's death, in fact, the succession change already in motion, George Simpson was confirmed as the new managing director of GEC, as The Independent reported that Simpson's inside knowledge of BAE, British Aerospace, was a key factor in his appointment. Weinstock was given the title of Chairman Emeritus and a small office. Within months, he was effectively gone, pushed upstairs with a hollow honour, while a man he barely knew took control of the empire he'd built over 4 decades. Weinstock described Simpson, publicly, as a man of vision. It was the last generous thing he'd say about the man who would destroy everything he'd built. George Simpson's vision could be summarised in a single sentence, a sentence that, in retrospect, reads like an epitaph carved on a tombstone. Cash in the bank, Simpson observed, earns a very low return. It was a perfectly reasonable statement delivered in the perfectly reasonable language of modern corporate finance. And it was the most expensive sentence in British industrial history. Because embedded in that sentence was a philosophy diametrically opposed to everything Weinstock had believed. Weinstock saw cash as insurance. Simpson saw it as inefficiency. Weinstock saw the war chest as the thing that made GEC unsinkable. Simpson saw it as dead money. Capital sitting idle when it should be working, growing, transforming the company into something faster, bigger, more exciting than the boring engineering conglomerate Weinstock had left behind. The cash mountain, the thing the city had mocked Weinstock for hoarding, was the very thing his successors would burn through in under 3 years. The boring strategy of keeping £2 billion in the bank was the strategy that had made the company unsinkable. Removing it would make the company defenceless. But nobody in that boardroom, in that spring of 1996, could see that yet. The dot-com boom was gathering force. Telecommunications was the future. The internet was going to change everything. And the man with the speed dialer and the 7 financial ratios had been replaced by a man who believed the future belonged to those who spent fastest. The fortress had held for 33 years. It was about to be demolished from the inside by its own new owners, using its own money. Chapter 8. A Man of Vision. George Simpson was born in Dundee on the 2nd of July 1942, the son of a flax mill manager. Grammar school, Dundee Institute of Technology. He became an accountant, a profession that, in the right hands, could be a launchpad for anything. In Simpson's hands, it launched a career built on a particular and repeatable skill, arriving at troubled companies, reorganising them, and moving on before the consequences of his reorganisation became fully visible. His CV read like a tour of British industry's revolving door. Leyland DAF. Then the Rover Group, where he served as managing director from January 1989. His job at Rover, in essence, was to make it attractive enough to sell. He succeeded. He negotiated the sale to BMW for £800 million, a transaction BMW would come to regret so bitterly that it became a case study in how not to acquire a car company. But that was BMW's problem. Simpson had already moved on. Next came Lucas Industries, where he became chief executive in 1993. He merged Lucas with America's Varity Corporation to create Lucas Varity, a transatlantic engineering group that looked impressive on paper. By the time Lucas Varity ran into difficulties, Simpson had already departed for GEC. A pattern was emerging. One former colleague captured it with surgical precision. George was a doctor, not a builder. He was like John Harvey Jones. He'd arrive at companies, sort them out, and move on. When it came to building, as at GEC, he was navigating in uncharted waters. Richard Coulthart, who'd worked with Simpson at Rover, provided the characterisation. Another analyst offered a blunter assessment. He could fall through the roof of a department store and land up on the ground floor wearing a new suit. It was meant as a compliment, a tribute to Simpson's extraordinary ability to emerge from corporate wreckage without a mark on him. In the context of what was about to happen to GEC, it reads differently. Simpson was clubbable, affable, a keen golfer, not just a keen golfer, a member of 7 golf clubs. Not only does this show a mad passion for the game, one profile observed, but perhaps an unnatural desire to be accepted. It was a telling detail. Weinstock had never needed to be accepted. He'd needed to be obeyed. The difference between the two men wasn't just one of style, it was a difference of fundamental orientation. Weinstock built things and counted the results. Simpson managed perceptions and negotiated exits. The man Simpson brought with him to GEC was, in many ways, his opposite in temperament, but his mirror in ambition. John Mayo had graduated from Loughborough University and started his career at Arthur Andersen, accountancy, like Simpson. But Mayo had moved into investment banking at S.G. Warburg, where he'd gained a reputation as abrasive but brilliant. He was a deal-maker. His instinct was transactional. His crowning achievement before GEC had been masterminding the demerger of Zeneca from Itisomaïs, one of the most significant corporate restructurings of the 1990s. It had earned him the job of finance director at Zeneca and a reputation in the city as a man who could dismantle and reassemble large companies with the confidence of a mechanic stripping an engine. At GEC, colleagues described Mayo as brilliant but utterly ruthless. His test for every business in the portfolio was brutally simple. If a division produced below 7% cash flow return on investment, after inflation and tax, it must cut costs. Above 12%, it should grow as fast as possible. Anything in between was on probation. An executive who worked under him described him as a terrier who nips at people's heels to get them moving. There was one detail about John Mayo that, in the wreckage that followed, would prove significant. He had never run a business. His entire career, accountancy, investment banking, corporate finance, had been spent advising, restructuring, and deal-making. He understood balance sheets, he understood transactions, and he understood how to take companies apart and put them back together on paper. What he had never done was manage a factory, deliver a product, meet a payroll, or look a shop steward in the eye and explain why the numbers didn't work. He was a financier in charge of an engineering company, and the distinction mattered more than anyone in that boardroom seemed to understand. Simpson arrived at GEC in September 1996. Within months, Weinstock was gone, eased out of his own company with the empty title of Chairman Emeritus and a small office that grew smaller by the week. Simpson began, with a thoroughness that suggested the plan had been formed long before he'd walked through the door, to dismantle the old guard. Long-standing executives were fired or eased out. Weinstock's people were replaced by Simpson's people. Mayo was the most important recruit, but he wasn't the only one. A new chairman, Sir Roger Hearn, was appointed. The culture shifted. The speed dialer went quiet. In July 1997, Simpson announced the results of a major strategic review. GEC would move away from its joint ventures, the defensive architecture Weinstock had spent decades constructing, and focus on global leadership in 3 areas: defence and aerospace through Marconi electronic systems, industrial electronics, and communications. The language was confident, modern, forward-looking. The subtext was unmistakable. The Weinstock era was over. The asset sales began immediately. Express lifts, sold. Satchwell Controls, sold. AB Dick, sold. Wire and Cables Group, sold. Marconi Instruments, sold to IFR Systems in February 1998. GEC Plessey Semiconductors, sold. Each sale stripped away another layer of the diversified portfolio Weinstock had maintained as insurance. Each sale generated cash that went into the war chest, cash that Simpson and Mayo had very specific plans for. In February 1998, the head office moved from Weinstock's Spartan Stanhope Gate to 1 Bruton Street, a symbolic break so deliberate it barely needed interpretation. The old man's austere kingdom, where directors bought their own newspapers and every other light bulb had been removed, was abandoned for newer, shinier premises. The speed dialer stayed behind. There were reasons, real, substantive reasons, why someone standing in GEC's boardroom in 1997 might have concluded that change was necessary. The Cold War was over. Defence budgets were shrinking across the Western world. Un-American defence contractors, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, were consolidating into giants that dwarfed their European counterparts. British firms needed scale to compete, or they'd be squeezed out entirely. The logic of defence consolidation was sound. Even Weinstock might have accepted it, though he'd have driven a harder bargain and kept more options open. And then there was the telecoms boom, the internet, mobile telephony, the promise of a new era of connectivity that would transform the global economy. The city was mesmerised. Telecoms stocks were soaring. Companies that had never made a profit were valued in the billions. The language of the era was intoxicating. Bandwidth, fibre, convergence, the information superhighway. Investors who'd spent decades being bored by GEC's steady, unspectacular returns were suddenly hungry for something faster, brighter, more exciting. Simpson and Mayo looked at GEC and saw a company sitting on a mountain of cash in the middle of the greatest technology revolution since the invention of the telephone. They saw an opportunity. The city saw an opportunity. The bankers and advisors who'd profit from the transactions to come certainly saw an opportunity. What none of them saw, or none of them wanted to see, was the cliff at the end of the runway. At Lucas, a former colleague had joked, "People are wondering how long GEC will last." It was meant as light teasing. It landed as prophecy. Chapter 9. Selling the crown jewels. The first fatal decision was the biggest, and on the surface it looked like the smartest. In January 1999, when George Simpson began negotiations to sell Marconi Electronic Systems, the entire defence electronics and naval shipbuilding business of GEC, to British Aerospace. The buyer's chief executive was Sir Richard Evans, described by one journalist as Simpson's old pal from their overlapping years in the defence industry. The two men understood each other. The deal moved quickly. By November 1999, it was done. Marconi Electronic Systems, MES, was sold to British Aerospace for £7.7 billion, a mixture of cash and shares. The merger created BAE Systems, overnight, the largest defence company in Europe. The price was considered very good. Simpson had extracted more than the market had expected. The city applauded. What the city was applauding was the sale of a century of British defence capability. The assets transferred to BAE Systems read like an inventory of everything GEC had built and everything Weinstock had guarded. Radar systems, including the ECR-90 for the Eurofighter Typhoon. Torpedo guidance systems through Marconi underwater systems. Naval combat systems fitted to warships around the world. 12 of the 16 Type 23 frigates. The VSEL submarine yard at Barrow-in-Furness, acquired by Weinstock just 4 years earlier. Boeing 777 fly-by-wire avionics. Tracor, a US defence contractor that GEC had purchased for $1.4 billion barely 18 months before, in June 1998. All of it, every radar set, every torpedo, every submarine hull, every line of avionics code, walked out of GEC's portfolio and into someone else's. Defence electronics had contributed up to 40% of GEC's group profits. It was the most stable, most cash-generative part of the entire empire. The division least vulnerable to economic cycles, least dependent on consumer fashion, most insulated from the boom and bust volatility that plagued every other sector Simpson was about to enter. It was, in the language Weinstock would have used, the foundation, and Simpson had sold the foundation to fund what he planned to build on top of it. Tony Blair's government was unhappy. Blair had wanted British Aerospace to merge with Daimler Chrysler Aerospace of Germany, creating a European defence champion to rival the American giants. The French and Germans were upset, but Simpson had his price, the BAE board had its prize, and the GEC board, such as it was, approved. Tens of thousands of defence workers transferred to BAE Systems. They kept their jobs, but their employer was now a different company, answering to different shareholders, pursuing a different strategy. GEC's century of defence capability was gone. Simpson now had approximately £4.5 billion in cash to deploy, the $7.7 billion from the BAE sale, plus the existing war chest, minus the various asset sales and ongoing costs. The question was simple: what would he buy? The answer arrived in March 1999. Reltec Corporation, an American manufacturer of last-mile telecom access products, the equipment that connected telephone exchanges to homes and businesses. The price? $2.1 billion, approximately £1.3 billion. Reltec was a loss-making company. Its net assets were less than £150 million. Simpson was paying nearly 9 times the value of the assets he was acquiring, for a company that couldn't turn a profit. The following month, April 1999, came the second acquisition. 4. Systems, an American maker of ATM networking switches, the hardware that routed data across telecommunications networks. The price, $4.5 billion, approximately £2.8 billion. In cash. 4 systems like Reltec had minimal assets, less than £150 million. The $4.5 billion price tag was paid at the absolute peak of the dot-com bubble, for a company whose technology was already facing competition from newer, cheaper alternatives. The mathematics deserves a moment of plain statement. 4. Systems cost $4.5 billion, and the company had less than £150 million in assets. That is a premium of approximately 30 to 1 over asset value. Paid in cash, at the top of the market. The combined cost of the two acquisitions, Reltec and 4, was approximately $6.6 billion. The combined assets of the two companies were less than £300 million. Simpson and Mayo had taken the proceeds of selling a century of British defence capability, radar, torpedoes, frigates, submarines, avionics, and exchanged them for 2 American technology companies with almost no tangible assets, no reliable profits, and valuations inflated by a speculative bubble that was already showing cracks. The Spectator would later write, ours with the controlled fury of a publication that understood exactly what had happened. City bankers advising Simpson and Mayo on their deals knew full well that the pair were being extraordinarily reckless. Marconi's advisors will have had to develop detailed forecasts to justify the price paid for each acquisition. They will have been well aware that these forecasts were fanciful in the extreme. The bankers collected their fees, Simpson and Mayo collected their confidence, and the war chest, 4 decades of carefully accumulated cash, the thing that had made GEC unsinkable, was gone. But the spending wasn't finished. Through 1999 and into 2000, at least 9 more acquisitions followed, totalling approximately £425 million. By early 2001, the company that had been GEC, now renamed, rebranded, or reimagined, had no fewer than 11 newly acquired companies to integrate. 11 different corporate cultures, 11 different product lines, 11 different sets of financial systems, and no consolidated financial reporting platform to track any of it. An Oracle implementation was underway, but it was incomplete. The board was flying blind, spending billions while unable to see, with any clarity, what it actually owned. The profitable divisions that Weinstock had maintained as insurance were being sold off to fund the spree. GEC Alstom, the rail and power joint venture with France, floated as a public company. GEC's stake progressively sold. The retail and food arm sold for £102.5 million. Half a share in a Russian telephone network sold for $60 million. Each sale removed another basket from Weinstock's portfolio. Each sale narrowed the company's base. Each sale made the bet on telecoms more concentrated, more irreversible, more catastrophic if it went wrong. The advisors collected their fees, the lawyers collected their fees, the accountants collected their fees, and the fortune that Arnold Weinstock had spent a lifetime assembling was converted, transaction by transaction, into ownership of American technology companies that would soon be worth a fraction of what was paid for them. Chapter 10. Marconi won't just hit the ground running. On the 1st of December 1999, GEC officially ceased to exist. The 100-year-old name was erased. The company was renamed Marconi plc, borrowing the luster of the wireless pioneer's name for a venture that had nothing to do with wireless telegraphy and everything to do with internet-era telecommunications. A new advertising campaign was launched. The image of a secretive defense company was to be replaced by the image of a global telecommunications company to rival Nortel, Lucent and Cisco. These were the names Simpson and Mayo measured themselves against, American and Canadian telecoms giants valued in the tens or hundreds of billions, companies that had ridden the dot-com wave to valuations that made traditional industrial firms look like relics. Simpson's confidence was total. In November 1999, addressing investors and the press, he delivered the line that would become his epitaph. Marconi won't just hit the ground running. It'll take off as Europe's brightest technology company. For a brief, vertiginous moment, the market agreed. The share price, around 300 pence in the old GEC days, rose to 801.5 pence at the Marconi launch. By August 2000, it peaked at approximately £12.50. Market capitalisation, £35.5 billion. Simpson and Mayo were hailed as visionaries. The boring old defence conglomerate had been transformed into a technology superstar. The city, which had spent years complaining that Weinstock was sitting on his cash, celebrated the men who were spending it. In October 2000, Marconi listed on Nasdaq, the American technology exchange, a move that signalled ambitions reaching far beyond Britain. The company was now, at least in its own imagination, a transatlantic technology giant. The future was fibre optic. The future was bandwidth. The future was bits and bytes and the information superhighway. The annual report for 2000 described the internet boom, without irony, as a high-tech gold rush, a latter-day Klondike of bits and bandwidth. Then the gold rush ended. In late 2000, the dot-com bubble burst. It didn't burst quietly. It burst with a violence that destroyed hundreds of billions of dollars in market value across the global technology sector. The companies Simpson and Mayo had chosen as their peers and their role models began issuing warnings that read like dispatches from a retreating army. Lucent Technologies. Profit warning. Cisco Systems. Massive write-downs. Nortel Networks. Catastrophic losses that would eventually lead to the company's destruction. The titans of the telecoms boom were discovering, one after another, that the demand they'd projected, the insatiable hunger for bandwidth, for networking equipment, for the infrastructure of the digital future, had been wildly, recklessly overstated. The customers weren't buying. The orders weren't coming. The revolution had been postponed. BT, one of Marconi's largest European customers, was saddled with enormous debt from the 3G mobile license auctions, the government spectrum sales that had extracted tens of billions from telecoms operators across Europe. BT began cutting back on network investment. Cable and Wireless issued a profit warning, cut 4,000 jobs and reduced its investment programme by £600 million. A Marconi spokesman, speaking with the candour of someone watching the taps close in real time, admitted, "The tap has been turned off very quickly. Everything is now being referred to customers' finance departments and they are blocking contracts." But Marconi denied it was affected. In April and May of 2001, the company reassured investors that despite deteriorating market conditions, its core business remained healthy. Revenue would rise. The geographic and business mix left Marconi relatively immune from the downturn affecting its competitors. The reassurances were specific, confident, and, as subsequent events would demonstrate, disconnected from reality. The Financial Times later judged that Marconi's executives were either failing to see the warning signs or ignoring them. The internal problem was structural. With 11 newly acquired companies and no unified financial reporting system, the Oracle implementation still incomplete, the board could not see its own numbers clearly. The reporting software, as the Register noted with dry technical precision, saw nothing coming. Simpson and Mayo had built a company so complex, so hastily assembled, so poorly integrated that they couldn't read their own instruments. They were flying at speed, in cloud, with broken dials. The crash, when it came, arrived not as a gradual descent, but as a sudden and catastrophic loss of altitude. In late June 2001, it became evident that sales had suffered a steep and accelerating decline. On the 2nd of July, Marconi internally acknowledged that its performance expectations had fundamentally changed. On the 3rd, it was clear that a profit warning was inevitable. The situation was complicated by the simultaneous sale of Marconi Medical Systems, Picker International, the medical imaging division, to Philips of the Netherlands for $1.1 billion. The timing created a problem. The positive news of the Philips transaction and the devastating news of the profit warning would arrive within minutes of each other. On the 4th of July 2001, at 7:26 in the morning, the Philips transaction was announced. 15 minutes later, Marconi shares were suspended. They remained suspended for an entire trading day, a measure so unusual for a FTSE 100 company that it announced, louder than any press release, that something had gone catastrophically wrong. That evening, a contentious board meeting, then the announcement, 4,000 job cuts, including 1,000 managers, a 15% drop in the sales forecast, a 50% fall in operating profit. Simpson addressed the cameras with the strained composure of a man standing in front of a building that was already on fire. Can I make it absolutely clear? Marconi is financially sound. Few believed him. On the 5th of July, trading resumed. The share price dropped 54% in a single day. It was the largest one-day fall of a FTSE 100 stock in history. The company's market value crashed from £35.5 billion, the September 2000 peak, to £2.8 billion. Some 10% of Marconi's entire issued stock changed hands in a single session. Investors weren't selling. They were fleeing. The Financial Services Authority later found that Marconi had breached market rules by delaying the profit warning. The company had known on the 2nd of July that its numbers had collapsed. It didn't announce until after market close on the 4th. Carol Sargent, the FSA's managing director, censured the company formally. The delay wasn't criminal, but it was damning. The market had been trading on false information for 2 days, and the company had allowed it. John Mayo was dismissed from the board within days. At a meeting with analysts shortly before the crisis, he had been asked a pointed question about Marconi's prospects. His response included the quip, "But I don't work for Alcatel," a reference to a struggling French competitor. One analyst, recalling the moment, said, "It was not the day for jokes. It smacked of a smug arrogance." It was the last thing Mayo said in public as a Marconi executive. In Simpson's promise, Marconi won't just hit the ground running, it'll take off, had been delivered in November 1999. 20 months later, the share price had fallen 95%. Chapter 11. The longest fall. After Mayo's departure, Simpson tried to hold on. Sir Roger Hearn, the chairman, initially backed him, but the numbers kept deteriorating, the share price kept falling, and the world outside was collapsing too. September 2001 brought not only a second Marconi profit warning, but the attacks on the World Trade Center, which plunged global markets into freefall and obliterated whatever fragile hope remained that the telecoms downturn might be temporary. In September 2001, both Simpson and Hearn were forced out. Derek Bonham was brought in as interim chairman. Simpson walked away with a reported £1 million in severance. It's £1 million. For the man who had presided over the destruction of $35 billion in shareholder value, the elimination of tens of thousands of jobs, and the dismantling of a century of defence capability. The share price continued to fall. From £12.50 at peak, to under £1, to under 30 pence by autumn 2001, to single digits. The trajectory was relentless, vertical, and watched with a kind of horrified fascination. By financial markets that had never seen a FTSE 100 company disintegrate at this speed. The company that had once sat on over £2 billion in cash was now burdened with approximately £4.3 billion in debt. The arithmetic was almost incomprehensible. In under 3 years, N. Simpson and Mayo had taken a company with $2 billion in cash and turned it into a company with $4.3 billion in debt, a swing of over £6 billion. The war chest hadn't just been spent. It had been spent. And then the company had borrowed billions more on top, leveraging itself to the hilt to fund acquisitions whose value was evaporating by the week. The job losses came in waves, each one hitting communities that had already been weakened by the wave before. In Coventry, more than 4,500 people had been employed before 2001. The first round arrived in July. 322 jobs announced in a single stroke. Tom Keogh, an official with the MSF union in Coventry, had spoke with the cold anger of a man who'd watched something precious destroyed by people who'd never set foot on his members' factory floor. It's a disgraceful way to treat skilled and educated people. A further 1,000 jobs were announced in subsequent months. By 2005, after BT excluded Marconi from a major contract, another 450 were cut. The workforce that had once exceeded 4,500 was reduced, round by round, cut by cut, to approximately 1,800. Rob Williams, aged 37, a Coventry employee, described the atmosphere inside the walls. It's a great shame to think that more than 300 jobs will go. There is a feeling of inevitability in the offices, but there is also a feeling of dread at who will be the next to go. Inevitability and dread. And two words that captured the lived experience of a workforce watching their employer disintegrate in real time, unable to stop it, unable to look away, waiting each morning to find out whether they still had a job. Paul Ellis was 21, a customer administrator at the Coventry site, young enough to have his whole career ahead of him, young enough to have joined Marconi believing it was a company with a future. "I don't know what is happening here," he said. "We're really kept in the dark. You hear that loads of jobs are going, but you don't understand why." He didn't understand why. 21 years old, working in an office in Coventry, and nobody had explained to him that his employer had sold its defence business, spent the proceeds on overvalued American technology companies, failed to integrate them. They missed the collapse of the telecoms market, issued a delayed profit warning, and destroyed £35 billion in shareholder value. Nobody had explained it because, at his level, nobody could. The decisions had been made in boardrooms and investment banks and city restaurants. The consequences were landing on a factory floor in the Midlands, on the desk of a young man who just wanted to know whether he still had a job next week. An unnamed long-serving employee offered the kind of testimony that statistics can't capture. "I've been working here since it was the GEC, and it's sad when you lose colleagues you've worked with for many years." Since it was the GEC. 5 words that measured the distance between what the company had been and what it had become. This person had lived through the Weinstock years. The stability, the austerity, the wage packet, the certainty. They'd survived the renaming, the restructuring, the asset sales, the acquisition spree. And now they were watching colleagues they'd known for years being escorted from the building with cardboard boxes and statutory redundancy payments. In Liverpool, over 630 employees faced the same gathering storm. Factory production was outsourced to Jabal Circuits, an American contract manufacturer. In Poole, Dorset, a smaller facility was closed entirely, 570 jobs lost. Some were offered transfers to Coventry, a relocation that meant uprooting families from the south coast and moving them to a city where the employer they were relocating for was itself in the process of disintegrating. In Beeston, Nottingham, 350 employees were affected. In Chelmsford, the birthplace, the spiritual home, the town that had been Marconi's since 1898, headquarters functions were cut. Research and development roles reduced. The works that had once hummed with the sound of radar assembly and the smell of solder grew quieter, department by department, corridor by corridor. Danny Carrigan, a national officer with Amicus AEEU, responded to each round of cuts with statements that grew progressively more resigned. This is obviously a real blow to our hopes of sustaining the workforce at current levels. Union officials were often not informed of redundancy numbers before they appeared in the press. The workforce read about its own destruction in the newspapers before hearing it from management. And at the shareholders' AGM in July 2001, 3 hours of acrimony that the financial press described as the most hostile corporate meeting in recent memory, shareholders who had watched their investments evaporate demanded answers. Some called for the resignation of the entire board. Others demanded 50% pay cuts for directors. Simpson, still in post at that point, stood at the podium and told them Marconi was financially sound. It was the same phrase he'd used on the day of the profit warning. It was no more believable the second time. Neil Sutcliffe, Marconi's chief HR officer, would later recall the particular trauma of managing large-scale redundancy inside a company that was itself vanishing. He described arriving at Marconi's offices on London's Euston Road and finding that the company wasn't even listed on the building's directory board. The name on the door had been removed. The company was disappearing not just from the stock exchange, but from the physical fabric of the buildings it occupied. The restructuring, when it came, was the final humiliation. In May 2003, Marconi was restructured as Marconi Corporation plc through a debt-for-equity swap. Creditors exchanged their debt for ownership of the company. Original shareholders, the people who had held GEC stock through the Weinstock years, who had trusted that the war chest would protect their investment, who had watched the share price soar to £12.50 and believed they were witnessing the birth of Europe's brightest technology company, were left with 0.5% of the value of their investment, half a penny in the pound. If you had held £100,000 worth of Marconi shares at peak, they were worth £500 at the restructuring. And the company offered those original shareholders the option, presented, presumably, without irony, of digging into their own pockets to subscribe to up to 5% of the new equity, paying more money for shares in the company that had just destroyed their savings. Simpson received £1 million on his way out. The average redundant Marconi worker received a statutory redundancy payment. Chapter 12. The Birthplace of Radio. George Simpson. We created Baron Simpson of Dunkeld in 1997, a Labour life peer, elevated during the same period he was dismantling GEC, retreated into private life after his departure from Marconi in September 2001. He retreated to his golf clubs. No public expression of contrition has been found in the record. 7 clubs. He had plenty to choose from. John Mayo reinvented himself with the speed and agility that had characterised his entire career. He founded Celtic Pharma, a biotech private equity firm, became a partner at Beehive Capital LLP, held a directorship at Newcastle United Limited, among other roles. The dealmaker found new deals to make. The man who had spent £4.5 billion of other people's money on 2 American technology companies that were worth a fraction of the purchase price found, it seems, and no difficulty in finding new people willing to entrust him with capital. Neither man faced criminal charges. The Serious Fraud Office did not prosecute. The FSA censured the company for the delayed profit warning, but imposed no personal penalties on Simpson or Mayo. The 2 men who presided over the destruction of Britain's largest technology conglomerate, the elimination of tens of thousands of jobs, the obliteration of £35 billion in shareholder value, the sale of a century of defence capability to fund a speculation that collapsed within 18 months, walked away with their pensions, their titles and their liberty. Arnold Weinstock did not walk away. He had nowhere to walk to. The company was his life's work, and watching it destroyed, from a small office with a hollow title, unable to intervene, and unable to prevent what was happening, was a torment that those who knew him believed accelerated his decline. He died on the 23rd of July, 2002. He was 77 years old. Cancer. On the same day, Marconi issued another set of results so dismal they could barely keep the market value above £100 million. The Accountancy Age obituary captured the symmetry with the restrained devastation of a publication that understood the significance of both events occurring simultaneously. It is immeasurably sad that Arnold Weinstock should have died on the same day that his company, Marconi, issued another set of results so dismal that they could barely keep the market value of the group above £100 million. The obituary continued. The stress of watching others take 2 years to destroy the corporate empire he built up over 4 decades might even, to some extent, have been literally mortifying. Literally mortifying. A careful choice of words from a financial publication. The stress of watching the destruction may have contributed to the death of the man who built the thing being destroyed. The empire and its emperor ending on the same day. What remained of the company stumbled on for 3 more years, each one worse than the last. The debt for equity restructuring in May 2003 created Marconi Corporation plc, a company that existed primarily to service the obligations its predecessors had created and to find a buyer willing to take what was left. In 2005, the final blow arrived from an unexpected direction. BT, once one of Marconi's largest customers, was building its 21st century network, a massive upgrade of Britain's telecommunications infrastructure. It was the largest telecoms contract in British history. Marconi, whose entire strategy under Simpson had been built on the premise that it would be a major supplier to exactly these kinds of projects, bid for every lot. It won nothing. Not a single contract. BT awarded the work to Huawei, Fujitsu, Siemens, Alcatel, Ericsson and Ciena. And the company that had renamed itself Marconi to signal its telecoms ambitions was shut out of the biggest telecoms contract in its home market. On price. The final indignity. Later that year, Ericsson of Sweden acquired the majority of Marconi Communications for approximately £1.2 billion. The Marconi name, the brand, the intellectual property, the residual operations in Coventry, Liverpool and Chelmsford. All of it sold to a Swedish company for a sum that was less than a third of what Simpson and Mayo had paid for 4 systems alone. Peter Skite, a national official with amicus, welcomed the takeover with the weary relief of a man choosing the least worst option. The takeover by Ericsson, a world-class company, will come as some relief to Marconi workers. Relief. Not celebration. Not optimism. At relief, the emotion of people who had been bracing for something even worse. The remainder of the company was renamed Telent plc, a rump entity that existed to hold the UK pension scheme that Ericsson didn't want. On the 27th of October 2006, Marconi Corporation plc was voluntarily wound up. The company that had been born from Guglielmo Marconi's first wireless experiments, that had grown into GEC under Hugo Hurst, that had been built into Britain's mightiest technology conglomerate by Lord Weinstock, that had been worth £35 billion 6 years earlier, ceased to exist. The sites tell the story that balance sheets can't. In Chelmsford, the New Street Works site has been redeveloped. The original Hall Street factory, the converted silk mill where 26 men started building wireless equipment in 1898, at the world's first wireless factory, still stands. It's owned by Essex and Suffolk Water Company. It doesn't make wireless equipment. It doesn't make anything. The Marconi Research Centre at Great Baddow became BAE Systems Applied Intelligence Laboratories. A reminder that the defence work GEC once did continues, under a different name for a different owner. In December 2004, the Marconi Collection, over 250 physical artefacts documenting a century of wireless innovation, was donated to the nation via the University of Oxford. The collection now resides in the History of Science Museum. The objects that chart the invention and development of wireless communication in Britain sit in glass cases in a museum in Oxford. The company that made them no longer exists. In Coventry, but the 900,000 square foot site on Binley Road was reduced. The company moved to a smaller 400,000 square foot purpose-built facility at New Century Park. The surplus land became a business park and a housing estate. Ericsson absorbed what remained of the operations. The streets where Karen Hancock's remembered virtually every person in Coventry working for GEC still exist. The employer doesn't. In Liverpool, operations were outsourced to Jabil Circuits, then absorbed into Ericsson. The factory that had employed over 630 people making communications equipment for a British company now existed, in whatever form it took, as a footnote in a Swedish corporation's global supply chain. And then there is the comparison that makes the full scale of the catastrophe impossible to ignore. The defence arm that Simpson sold for £7.7 billion in 1999 became the core of BAE Systems. Today, BAE Systems is the largest defence contractor in Europe and the sixth largest in the world. Its current chief executive, Ian King, is a Weinstock protégé, a man who came up through the GEC system, learned the discipline, absorbed the culture, and now runs the company that inherited everything Simpson sold. BAE Systems' market capitalisation stands at approximately £35 to £40 billion. The defence arm alone, the thing Simpson sold to fund his telecoms adventure, is now worth roughly what the entire GEC was worth at its peak. The telecoms business it was sold to fund is worth nothing. The sum total of Simpson and Mayo's strategy is visible in that single comparison. They sold an asset now worth £35 billion and bought assets now worth zero. The mathematics needs no editorial. It speaks for itself. Weinstock died on the day the last numbers came in. Simpson retreated to his golf clubs. Mayo moved on to the next deal. And the company that Marconi had started in a silk mill, that Hearst had built on electric bells, that Weinstock had forged into the mightiest technology empire Britain had ever known, the company was gone. What remains is what always remains when something irreplaceable is destroyed. Not the thing itself. The memory of it. The Marconi collection behind glass in Oxford. A water company occupying the world's first wireless factory. A housing estate where a 900,000 square foot works used to stand. And across 100 towns and cities, in Chelmsford and Coventry and Liverpool and all the other places where the works hooter once marked the rhythm of the day, the silence it left behind. A war chest built over 40 years, spent in 3, and 3 faint clicks, pip, 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 crossing an ocean in 1901, starting something that would take a century to build and 5 years to destroy.